Right then, this is a 20-minute presentation for the ash tree. We're now on the day where the sun travels from willow tree to the ash tree. And for the next 18 days or so, it's the days of ash. Ash is the final tree of the first quarter of the OGHAM. The OGHAM is divided into 4 groups of 5, and I'm not a Gaelic speaker, so I've spent years pronouncing it wrong, but each group is called an ACME, and I've always said ACME because it's spelled A-I-C-M-E, so in English it looks like ACME, but the closer to the correct pronunciation is ACME. So an ACME just means family or group or tribe or clan. So the first ACME is the ACME Beath, named after the birch tree. So it's the B group. But anyway, this is the ash is the finale of that first quarter. And I will, in the next few days, give a summary of the first 5 trees, because they do seem to tell their own story, concluding with the ash tree. And I've always seen the 4 OGHAM trees that have 5 slashes as conclusion trees. So ash concludes the first quarter, and it's the spring equinox tree, and apple concludes the second quarter, and it's a summer solstice tree, and so on. So I'll do a summary about that. And I think that I was talking to a chap called Leon Conrad about something that came up with the second ACME, the H group. And someone had pointed out that in Gaelic, the numbers 1 to 5 correspond with H, D, T, C, and Q, the second group of 5. And the suggestion was that maybe hawthorn should be seen as the first tree of the OGHAM, because it's number 1, followed by 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's very interesting. However, there is lore that the birch tree is the beginning. There was something written down about the very first OGHAM inscription was 7 slashes for 7 bees. B multiplied by 7 birch trees. Anyway, there's different ways of looking at the year, and if you're following the sun is reborn at winter solstice. So that's how I see the OGHAM. So the birch tree is the first tree after winter solstice, which is the yew tree. So yew tree is kind of like 0.00 midnight hour, and then 1 o'clock is the birch tree. So that's kind of how I see the first ACME. However, many ancient cultures did use the spring equinox to begin their year, and that's more to do possibly with agricultural things. So the agricultural year begins at the beginning of spring equinox or vernal equinox. So for instance, going way back to ancient Babylonia, they began their year after the first sight of the crescent moon after the spring equinox. So it's a faddly way of doing it, but it is a spring equinox observation. And Christianity does that with Easter. Like, for some reason they have 25th of December as a fixed date for Jesus's birth, but his death and resurrection moves all over the place. Easter's a different time every year. And the reason for that is because if they can, Easter is celebrated on the first Sunday after the, Easter is the first Sunday after the new moon, after the spring equinox. So Easter as well is a spring equinox observation, just like the ancient Babylonian thing. But anyway, the ash tree the conclusion tree of the Akma Beath holds the position of spring equinox. And that's a very important time of the year, because from that moment onwards, there is more daylight than there is nighttime. So symbolically, it can be seen as the power of light over the forces of darkness. And to my mind, and I'll give some logic further on, that corresponds best with the young king, Celtic god of light, Lugh, known as Lugus in Gaul. And I'll come back to that. But so the ash tree, each tree has 18 degrees of the zodiac. And the spring equinox is also the beginning of a new zodiac year. So the spring equinox corresponds with each sign of the zodiac, if you don't know, has 30 degrees width. And spring equinox marks the 0 point of the sign of Aries. So for the 30 degrees of Aries, the moment where it transitions from Pisces into Aries, that's the spring equinox, always. There's different ways of looking at that. There's regular zodiac astronomy, and then there's sidereal zodiacal astronomy. And what I'm talking about is neither. What I'm talking about is a fixed tropical grid based on the solstices and the equinoxes. Now, gradually over long periods of time, if you have an ancient site lined with the spring equinox sunrise, it will be seen that various constellations appear to travel backwards a little bit. And it's very, 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 very slow. It's about 1 degree every 70 years. But then it takes, so then what happens is it takes about 2,500 years for one zodiac sign to align with the spring equinox, and then another, and then another. And that's why you have sayings like the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. And it's because of what stars are aligned with the spring equinox. Anyway, the ash tree holds that. In itself, it has 18 degrees. So does the solstices. And so if you think of 18 degrees, there's 9 degrees and then another 9 degrees, okay? And so what the ash tree is the last 9 degrees of Pisces the fish, and it's the first 9 degrees of Aries the ram. And that place between Pisces the fish and Aries the ram is the spring equinox, or 0 degrees Aries. Now, there's horns of power. So symbolism for iconography. If you think of the goddess Ellen with her antlers, or the goat-foot god Pan with his horns, you know, or even like in Egypt, there's Amun-Ra with ram's horns. And wherever there's horns, they're not just meant to be animalistic, shamanic, demonism or whatever. They're symbols. They're symbols of times of the year is what they are. So winter solstice is when the sun enters the sign of Capricorn. And Capricorn literally means goat's horn. So any god or goddess with goat horns is actually representing the winter solstice, Capricorn. Equally, any god or goddess with ram's horns represents the spring equinox, because that's when the sun enters Aries the ram, you know. So it's either the goat's horns are representing the rebirth of light after the 3-day standstill of the winter solstice, or the ram's horns are representing Aries and the spring equinox and the beginning of an agricultural year or a zodiacal year. Now that's quite interesting, because in Celtic tradition, the horned god par excellence is Cernunnos, and Cernunnos, well attested with iconography in ancient Gaul, but he's also depicted on the famous Gundestrup cauldron. And in the Gundestrup cauldron, he's holding a snake, and this snake is a mysterious thing that appears in various bits of Celtic artwork. And it's not just a snake, the snake has ram's horns. It's a funny thing. So there is no snake in the real world with ram's horns. So what does it represent? And you know, even academics, they do call it the ram-horned serpent. Well, a bit like the occult symbol of the snake biting its own tail, you know, it's like they call it the Ouroboros, what have you, a continuous ever circling circle. The ram-horned serpent is that as well, because the sun's path through the year is known as the ecliptic, as it journeys around the whole year. And spring equinox is the beginning of that moment, and it's a ram. So the rest of the snake's tail gives you a kind of serpent with a ram's head, you know, and the horned god is holding that on the Gundestrup cauldron. Now, in classical astrology, Aries, the ram, governs the head. And we've touched on this with other Zoom sessions where we've talked about the three cauldrons and the lower cauldron and so forth. And the three fire signs govern each of the three cauldrons, and Aries, the ram, the spring equinox, governs the upper cauldron, governs the head. Now, Aries governs the head. And the previous zodiac sign, the end of the snake's body, if you like, the tail of the snake, is Pisces, and Pisces governs the feet. So this actual moment then, between the 9 degrees of Pisces and the first 9 degrees of Aries, in anatomical bodily astrology, it's Pisces governing the feet and Aries governing the head. So the sun has to jump from the feet to the head. And literally, we talked on that in the recent session about the lower cauldron. This is the salmon's leap, because Pisces is the salmon weir, and energetically the sun in the days of Ash is doing that, because Ash is 9 degrees Pisces and 9 degrees Aries. And there's interesting alchemy there too, because Pisces is a water sign and Aries is a fire sign. So there's an alchemy of fire and water. Now, energetically then, that's also a connection from the lower cauldron. I wrote down the infinite sea, as in ocean, the infinite sea of the lower cauldron, the salmon's weir, to the fire of inspiration in the head, the radiant brow. And Aries governs the head and all of that stuff. So the ash tree itself, then, there were in Ireland 5 sacred trees. I can't remember all of their names, but I had a quick look at them. And of the 5 ancient sacred trees, 3 of them were ash trees. It's very interesting. The other 2 are yew trees. So in the sanctity of trees, as far as Ireland was concerned, it's yew and ash. Now in the OGHAM grove, again, that's winter solstice and spring equinox. It's interesting. And again, the horned god thing. Now, in the Briatha OGHAM, where there's word kennings for each of the trees, it gives the ash tree the name Nin, N-I-N. It's not a name I use neon, I use N-I-O-N, but the theory is that Nin, or neon, means a forked branch. So it's an upright staff, I haven't got one here, with a fork at the end, like a victory sign. They call it a bifurcated staff, or the witchcraft name for that is a stang. You know, it's just a V shape, two branches at the top of a walking stick. Now, it's fairly modern as far as written evidence is concerned, but in witchcraft traditions, this forked branch is thought to represent it can be used in different ways, but it can also be used for setting up an altar in the forest. And in that kind of context, it represents the horns of the horned god. And so it's another interesting idea then, that ash is this branch fork or bifurcated staff or stang. Interesting when we've already observed how it can relate to Pan and the ram's horns and goat horns and stuff. Now, traditionally, ash is the favored wood for spears. And one of the Bryatheroum kennings is translated in English as establishment of peace. So there's a plane going overhead. And we're quite close to the airport here in Guernsey, so often there's planes going overhead, but they do stop in the evening. The establishment of peace corresponds with the spear as, you know, kind of like military defense, or if you're well equipped, you can bring peace. I know I'm not sure about that as a meaning, but it is, the spear lore is certainly there, and it makes me mindful of the older tree being the tree of shields, and ash then being the tree of the spear. And that's interesting too with the Acma beef, that the emphasis in many ways is Imbolc and Brigid Bride Brigantia. And as Brigantia, she is depicted in Britain on Romano-Celtic altarpieces with a shield and with a spear. So it's interesting that the trees of the shield and the trees of the spear are in the quarter of the OGHAM that correspond with Imbolc and Brigid Bride Brigantia. Now, in Irish mythology, there are 4 magical items, and there's a magical spear, and it's the spear of Lugh, which is why, again, I see ash as representing Lugh. 2 reasons then for that logic is it's the tree of the spear and the sacred treasure is the spear of Lugh, but also Lugh in many different stories and in his Brythonic equivalents as well is the young god that overcomes the powers of darkness. And that's what he does, kind of like a pagan Archangel Michael or something. And the overcoming of the powers of darkness is symbolized with the spring equinox, because from that moment onwards, the days are longer than the night times. So night is defeated, if you like. So it's simple symbolism. And so the ash tree, one of 3 of the 5 sacred trees of Ireland, being the ash tree. So in the OGHAM, it corresponds with the spring equinox, and the spring equinox corresponds with the east and with the sunrise. So that rising light, or the sun appearing over the horizon at dawn, is that. Now, the spring equinox and ash tree are part of this tropical cross known as the sun cross. And simplistically, the sun cross is winter solstice, spring equinox, summer solstice, autumn equinox. So that's four, it's the year divided into 4 precise moments in time, and that's called the sun's cross, or the 4 stations of the sun. Now, that relates, like Aries, to the Upper Cauldron. And I'm going to do a session in a week or so about the Upper Cauldron. I'm actually going to save the Middle Cauldron until later in the summer when we're in Leo, because it's more appropriate for the sign of Leo, and Broom as the Grail Maiden makes much more sense with the Middle Cauldron stuff. But Aries and the Sun Cross are the Upper Cauldron. So without getting too complicated right now, it's to do with the mind and the way the mind works, especially in the way that the mind is divided into 2 halves. In old iconography, that can be represented as the sun and the moon, and it often is in many cathedrals and churches. You often get Jesus depicted with the sun and moon above his head, but that's from ancient iconography across the classical world. So simplistically, the sun and the moon, or light and dark, represent day and night. But when it comes to the mind, the sun is pure knowing. Pure knowing in the sense that it takes no thinking whatsoever. It's just knowing. It just is bright knowingness. The moon, on the other hand, is reflected sunlight, and by that it represents reflected mind. So it's the mind that reflects, that is, it ponders, it thinks, it contemplates, it muses. And we could also relate that to left brain, right brain ideas, but also, and more interestingly, awake and asleep. And asleep in a profound way. So you're talking about the sun being the awakened world, the world that's all around us when our eyes are wide open, and the moon being the visionary world, the world of dreams, shamanic visions, the world of psychic impressions, and all of that kind of thing. So the mind can function in daytime and nighttime, you know. And with when we do the Upper Cauldron workshop, we'll look into that into more detail, because there's a state of mind, a veil, if you like, a liminal place that the mind is in between being awake and falling asleep. And that's one state of mind, hypnopompic. And then the other state of mind is being asleep and then waking up, hypnagogic. And they're 2 different types of dreaming states. And we do that all the time. Every night we go to sleep and wake up in the morning, but we're also using that veil of reality when you're doing vision quests and shamanic journeys and psychic things as well. So even when you're awake and you're meditating, you're dipping in and out of those 2 different realms. So all of that stuff comes under the Upper Cauldron, and Aries the Ram, and light triumphant over darkness, because Aries governs the head. Now, just before I finish, just a little pattern. There is this pattern with the ash tree and spears, and what would you call it? Tree wizards, maybe. I think wizards of trees is probably as good an explanation as anything. So in Welsh lore, the god Gwydion, and the name Gwydion means born of trees. And all of his magic is tree magic, like he created the goddess Blodeuwedd out of flowers and trees and stuff. So in Welsh tradition, his staff, and sometimes his wand, is made of ash. Okay, so it's the ash wood is the magical wand or staff of Gwydion, the god of tree magic. And he's very much the kind of Welsh prototype of Merlin. Merlin is more medieval, knights in armor, chivalry kind of idea, but he and Gwydion have an awful lot in common, not only their Welsh origin, but both of them are trickster wizards. Gwydion tricks his sister Arianrhod into giving birth to Lugh, the sun god, and Merlin tricks Igraine into giving birth to Arthur, the sun god. Gwydion is god of trees and animates trees to fight the magical battle of the trees. And Merlin too is a wild man in the forest. There's a part of his story where he goes mad and he lives in the Caledonian forest as a wild tree man, really, you know, and on top of that, in the story of Merlin being wild in the Caledonian forest, he rides a stag and wears antlers on his head and leads a whole herd of antlers to the Rock of the Clyde to visit his wife. Strange stuff, but what is that? You know, it's canonous imagery, really, antler-headed Merlin. The medieval stories are evolutions of older pagan Celtic things, you know. So anyway, also Lugh, again, and the spear of Lugh, and ash being the tree of spears. Lugh is said to have invented the magical game Fidgel, which in Welsh is Gwythbwyll. So Lugh too is doing tree magic in a sense, you know, like Gwydion with his Battle of the Trees. And another thing with Gwydion is he's thought to be or have some connection with the Norse god Odin. Their names are very similar. And Odin achieved knowledge by hanging in the world tree, Yggdrasil. And in many traditions, sometimes it's a yew tree, but equally in Norse tradition, Yggdrasil is an ash tree. So again, this ash tree is the tree that births writing or letters born of a tree to Odin. And even in Christianity, like we observed earlier, that Easter, the resurrection myth of Christianity, is a spring equinox observation. And of course, Jesus was hung on a tree. It's not a crucifix in the Bible. It usually just says a tree. It became a crucifix much later, and pierced in the side with a spear. So again, you've got a tree and a spear with Jesus at spring equinox, and you've got Odin wounded with his spear on the world tree, and it being ash corresponding with spring equinox, as well as it being the spear of Lugh, and Lugh being light triumphant after the dark days of winter stuff. So anyway, I'll finish there. Plenty to think about. And we can think about that for the next 18 days or so as well. So I'll turn off the recording and you can put your microphones back on.